wanted to ask you, when you're talking about schizoid adaptations, there's some people who have autism who have also been diagnosed with schizoid personality disorder. Would you have any insights or comments regarding that situation?
Yes. Here's something that I learned from, the guys with Schizoid Angst. Schizoid Angst?
Yes.
Yeah. So he well, two things. One, he and I have, this applies. He and I have a difference of agreement. He mostly sees people socially and with his shows who are what I consider schizoid plus a lot of the time. So he believes that this is an inborn thing, and that it's society's responsibility to make accommodations for it. But I see high-functioning schizoids who don't need any kind of accommodation. They're suffering inside with schizoid issues. They still split, but they're running companies. Do you think a CEO needs an accommodation? They don't. One was a consultant to companies. Do you think she needs accommodation? So there possibly can be two different groups. Lots of times we make this group, we call them schizoid because they have some things in common. But really, these could be two different groups entirely. And one can have some kind of inborn predisposition that does require accommodations because they're not going to fully get out of it. But I call that schizoid plus. With however many years you give them, they'll adapt better and they'll know how to adapt. And other people have an adaptation that they weren't born with. They were born with a reasonably normal nervous system, maybe sensitive. I had my so-called normal schizoid clients, and I believe that they were born with a normal nervous system, and they developed schizoid adaptations because they were mistreated or they were abused, they were neglected, and they're not as difficult to treat. It's fairly straightforward. They did not feel safe. They adapted. They did things for themselves, et cetera, with therapy. They undid a lot of the coping mechanisms, substituted better coping mechanisms. And it was a long therapy, but it wasn't unusual. There wasn't things that I really, really didn't understand. And the first schizoid client that I kept and didn't refer to Masterson, was a young man, beard, small, nice. And he told me, now before the internet, the only people who found me without a referral were people who ended up as schizoid personality disorder. Because if you want to laugh, look at my website. I didn't even have it then. It's probably a misspelling. I didn't want to be found. People were referred to me. I wasn't a public figure as I am now. I write for Quora. I do these YouTubes. I was very private. I was a private extrovert. So whoever found me had to really do some research, and I don't know how they did it. And they were also the only people, my schizoid clients, that correctly came in with a self-diagnosis. Almost everyone else who self-diagnosed was wrong. My schizoid clients were right, almost invariably. So in comes this young man. He sits down, and he looks at me, and he tells me, I have schizoid personality disorder. What did he say next? I believe I'm on the autistic spectrum. I'm closer to the schizophrenic, to the very damaged end of that spectrum. And I'm also a transsexual. And I'd like to come to therapy with you. Okay. And I said, well, he had actually, the only thing I understood was transsexual. I had clients, I had a friend who had become one of the early transsexuals, male to female, had to go to, at that point, people were going to Europe for it. It was very rare to have it in this country. So I was familiar, and I had taken on lots of people who had unusual, for them, sexual whatevers. I didn't care. That people were people. And that didn't matter to me. So the only thing that I felt confident with of these three things was that he was trans. Yay, you're trans. But he says, that's not really my problem. And I said, I don't know anything about schizoid personality disorder. I don't feel adequate to treat you for it. I know very little about autistic. I had taken a class as an undergrad in Columbia in autism, and Columbia was a wonderful school if you ever get a chance to get into it or go. And there's a back door into it I can tell you about. The back door into the Ivy League, if people want to know. Well, anyway, I took that back door. A psychiatrist told me about it, and I'm in the Ivy League. And they take us in one of our, I'm in a psychology major, and they take us to Willowbrook. Now, Willowbrook was a hospital for people with autism. And it was one of the dreadful ones. And it took all comers. And they were careful about what they showed us. So I saw one room they prepared us for. I needed less prep than most people because I had grown up with psychotic psychopaths and people with personality disorders, and that was just my family. And so I was pretty at home in psych institutes. I was at home with odd people, but they really wanted to prepare us for what we were going to see because it wasn't going to be pleasant. They said, you're going to go in a room and you're going to see children we can't reach. And you're going to see them banging their heads on the wall. We've put them in helmets. And they're going to be shaking and they're going to be rocking. We take care of them as best we can. We try and prevent them from injuring themselves. So that's what they showed us, that room. And then they said, we also have a savant here, a schizoid savant, that is somebody who has an unusual ability to do something. Often it's something like you can tell them a date, like January 8th, 1938, and they'll tell you what day of the week it fell on, like this. That was this person's gift. So this person entertained us. They brought him out to show the other end of it. But he was still incarcerated. He wasn't living on his own. And I don't know if he could live on his own. I don't know what other issues he had or whether this was that. So that was my sum total. I didn't know people or any high-functioning autistic people to my knowledge before I met this man. And so he said, well, if you will read some books on schizoid that I recommend, if you want to know, the first book I read was by Masad Khan, Khan, and I don't remember any.
Khan. Okay.
You know who it is? So he said Masad Khan.
Khan,
and then I think
but not Nassid.
Yeah, I think another one was by Eigen. And then he said, for autism, could you watch the Temple Grandin documentary? And if you haven't seen that, Temple Grandin's a wonderful person who has autism. I believe she was in Australia, and she was quite a genius, and she thinks like an animal thinks, and she was able to invent ways that when they were taking cows, now remember, I'm part cow.
Oh, yeah.
Moo, cows are good people. Cows got frightened, she discovered, when they were taken to slaughter, not because of the slaughter so much, but because they were taking them straight. And cows don't like to go straight. So she made a curved ramp so the cows felt safer. So that was my introduction to schizoid, what I call schizoid plus. He had 2 pluses. Since then, I've had clients. I also had a schizotypal client, and that's very different. It's odd, eccentric, paranoid. Somewhere I would say schizotypal, a very smart woman, but very distinctly different than my schizoid clients, much more eccentric and odd. And she had paranoid delusions. But she could hold herself. She was somewhere between psychosis and a personality disorder, but she was smart enough and able to work despite her difficulties. And she was able to attend group therapy with a group of people who were very varied, and in it was another schizoid person, and so forth. So that's where I kind of started with all this with Schizoid Plus. Since then, I've met people that I think are somewhere on the autistic spectrum, but they were less autistic in certain ways. How did my client who said he was autistic, I didn't really understand this at that time, but who was Schizoid Plus autistic plus the trans was, we didn't even bother with the trans. He was happy being trans. He was happy with where he was. That wasn't the problem. And, people make this huge, yes, it's a problem for many people because of body dysphoria, but that was, he had more severe problems, than that. So I forgot where I was going with that. Do you remember, Pensy, where I was?
I think he was just explaining that he thought that he was schizoid and also autistic. He presented himself in that way too.
Yeah, and he turned out, oh yes, thank you. He had a question, which was how I realized he was autistic. From what I later started reading on autism, he said, "I don't understand." And he asked the group. He was brave enough to come to group as well, with a pillow in front of him. I had Narcissistic, the whole thing sitting in a corner, and we did experiment quite a bit on things. And he says, how do you know what to believe when a person's speaking? Sometimes the content of what they were saying does not agree with their voice tone or the look on their face. So I would explain, my Ph.D. I did it on nonverbal behavior, dominance, and gender. So I was, prepared to explain nonverbal behavior, certainly. And no matter how I explained it, it didn't get through. He was very tone sensitive. And so he would get the real meaning from the tone, or he would go with the tone a lot. But he said there must be a better way. And no matter how it was explained, it never became clear to him in the way that it would become clear to other people.